Maria quietly pushed her cleaning cart through the marble halls of the prestigious Einstein Institute for Advanced Physics, her simple gray uniform and worn sneakers making barely a sound on the polished floor. To the brilliant scientists and graduate students who barely noticed her existence, she was just another invisible service worker. But when the arrogant department head, Dr. Harrison, mockingly challenged her to solve an impossible quantum mechanics equation scrawled across the conference room whiteboard, he had no idea he was speaking to Dr. Maria Santos, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who had been working undercover to expose the Institute's toxic culture of elitism and discrimination. What happened next would not only shatter every assumption in that room but transform the entire institution forever. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The morning sun filtered through the towering glass windows of the Einstein Institute for Advanced Physics, casting long shadows across the pristine marble floors that Maria Santos had been polishing since dawn. Her weathered hands gripped the handle of her cleaning cart with practiced ease, the squeaky wheel announcing her presence as she moved through corridors lined with portraits of Nobel laureates and breakthrough discoveries that had shaped our understanding of the universe. She wore the same gray uniform every day, a simple cotton blend that had faded from countless washes, paired with comfortable sneakers that had seen better days, but still carried her silently through the hallowed halls of one of the world's most prestigious research institutions. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her unadorned face bore the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to navigate the world without drawing attention to herself. To the brilliant minds that populated these corridors, she was invisible, just another member of the support staff who kept their academic paradise running smoothly while they pursued the mysteries of quantum mechanics and theoretical physics. As she dusted the conference room tables where graduate students had left behind notebooks filled with complex equations, Maria's eyes would linger on their work longer than necessary, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly as she absorbed the mathematical relationships sprawled across whiteboards and scattered papers. When she encountered a particularly elegant proof or a clever approach to wave function collapse, the corners of her mouth would twitch upward in what might have been recognition or perhaps appreciation for the intellectual beauty before her. The other cleaning staff often wondered why Maria chose to work the early morning shift in the physics building when she could have requested the easier assignments in the administrative wing. But she simply smiled and explained that she enjoyed the quiet atmosphere where great minds grappled with the fundamental forces of nature. None of them suspected that as she emptied wastebaskets filled with discarded calculations and wiped down chalkboards covered in Schrödinger equations, Maria was conducting her own careful study of the Institute's culture, observing not just the scientific work but the human dynamics that played out in this temple of learning, where brilliance was worshipped and those deemed lesser were treated as if they existed merely to serve the chosen few. Dr. Richard Harrison swept into the physics building each morning, like a man who owned not just his corner office, but the very laws of nature themselves, his handcrafted Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his place at the top of the academic hierarchy. His suits were tailored to perfection, always in shades of charcoal or navy that spoke of old money and older privilege, complemented by silk ties that cost more than most graduate students made in a month, and cufflinks that caught the light as he gestured dismissively at anyone he deemed beneath his intellectual station. At 45, Harrison had built his reputation on groundbreaking work in quantum field theory. But somewhere along the way, his brilliance had curdled into arrogance, and his achievements becoming weapons he wielded against anyone who dared to question his authority or simply had the misfortune of crossing his path on a day when his ego demanded fresh validation. Graduate students scattered like startled birds when they saw him approaching, knowing that his sharp tongue could reduce months of research to worthless scribbling with a single cutting remark delivered in his clipped, aristocratic accent that he had cultivated during his years at Cambridge and never bothered to soften upon his return to American academia. He treated the support staff with the casual indifference of someone who had never learned their names and never intended to, viewing them as interchangeable parts in the machine that served his comfort and convenience. When a janitor moved too slowly while mopping the hallway, Harrison would make exaggerated sighs and pointed comments about efficiency to whoever happened to be within earshot, his voice dripping with the kind of disdain that came so naturally to him that he seemed unaware of how cruel it sounded to anyone with a functioning conscience. His office walls were lined with awards and photographs of him shaking hands with other distinguished scientists, a shrine to his own accomplishments that he would reference constantly during conversations, as if his past successes granted him immunity from basic human decency. Even his colleagues had learned to navigate carefully around his volatile moods, knowing that Harrison's definition of intellectual discourse often devolved into personal attacks on anyone who dared to present ideas that challenged his worldview or threatened his position as the department's undisputed alpha. He wore his cruelty like another expensive accessory, polished and displayed for all to see, never suspecting that his treatment of others revealed far more about his character than all his published papers and academic honors ever could. The whiteboard in Conference Room A had become a monument to collective frustration, its surface covered in layer upon layer of mathematical notation that told the story of 3 weeks of intellectual warfare against an equation that seemed determined to guard its secrets. The problem stretched across the entire 12-foot expanse of the board, a sprawling beast of quantum field operators, Feynman diagrams, and tensor calculus that represented the theoretical foundation for the Institute's most ambitious project, a revolutionary quantum computing architecture that could theoretically solve problems in minutes that would take classical computers millennia to crack. Dr. Chen, the project's lead researcher, had first presented the equation with trembling hands and dark circles under her eyes, explaining to the assembled team that their entire 5-year, $50 million grant hinged on solving this single mathematical puzzle that governed the behavior of entangled particles in their proposed quantum matrix. Graduate students had sacrificed sleep and social lives, filling notebook after notebook with attempted solutions, each approach seeming to lead down rabbit holes of increasing complexity until they emerged more confused than when they started. Professors from 3 different departments had been called in for consultation, bringing their specialized knowledge of topology, statistical mechanics, and computational theory, only to stare at the equation with the same mixture of fascination and defeat that had claimed their younger colleagues. The deadline loomed like a sword of Damocles over the entire department. In 2 weeks, representatives from the National Science Foundation would arrive expecting a presentation of their breakthrough methodology, and without this equation solved, years of work would crumble into academic embarrassment and professional ruin. Coffee cups accumulated like archaeological layers around the conference table as research teams worked in shifts, attacking the problem from every conceivable angle, employing techniques that ranged from brute force computational approaches to elegant theoretical frameworks borrowed from string theory and beyond. Harrison would stride past the conference room several times each day, pausing to examine their progress with the air of a general surveying a battlefield where his troops were losing ground to an invisible enemy, his expression growing darker with each passing day as the solution remained frustratingly elusive. The equation had become more than a mathematical challenge. It was a test of the Institute's collective intelligence, a puzzle that seemed to mock their expertise and credentials with its stubborn refusal to yield to their considerable intellectual firepower. Visiting scholars had attempted to contribute, but even minds from MIT, Stanford, and CERN had retreated in respectful defeat, acknowledging that this particular problem existed at the bleeding edge of human understanding, where traditional approaches broke down and new paradigms waited to be discovered by someone with the insight to see what everyone else had missed. Dr. Harrison entered Conference Room A that Tuesday morning with his usual theatrical flourish, expecting to find his research team making progress on the equation that had become his personal obsession, but instead discovered only Maria quietly dusting the table surfaces with methodical precision, her cleaning cloth moving in slow, careful circles around the scattered papers and empty coffee cups that marked another night of fruitless intellectual combat. His perfectly groomed eyebrows arched with the kind of disdain usually reserved for undergraduate mistakes as he observed her working mere inches from the whiteboard that contained what he considered the most important unsolved problem, modern physics, her proximity to his sacred mathematical territory somehow offensive to his sensibilities. "Well? Well?" Harrison drawled, his voice carrying that particular blend of amusement and condescension that had become his signature tone when addressing anyone he deemed intellectually inferior. Perhaps our cleaning lady has some insights into quantum field theory that have eluded our finest minds. Maria continued her work without looking up. But Harrison noticed the slight pause in her movements, the way her shoulders seemed to tense almost imperceptibly before resuming their steady rhythm. And this tiny reaction only encouraged him to continue his performance for an audience that now included Dr. Peterson and Professor Williams, who had arrived expecting a morning briefing but found instead an opportunity to witness their department head's casual cruelty. After all, Harrison continued, straightening his designer tie with theatrical precision, sometimes it takes a simpler mind to see what we overcomplicated intellectuals have missed. Don't you think, Maria? The way he pronounced her name made it sound like a foreign word he was reluctant to allow past his lips, each syllable dripping with the kind of patronizing sweetness that cut deeper than outright insult. Dr. Peterson shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, while Professor Williams managed a nervous chuckle that sounded more like a cough. Both men caught between their desire to avoid Harrison's wrath and their growing discomfort with his behavior. Maria finally looked up from her dusting, her dark eyes meeting Harrison's pale blue ones with a steadiness that momentarily surprised him. Though he quickly dismissed the flicker of intelligence he glimpsed there as a trick of the morning light streaming through the conference room windows. "I apologize for disturbing your work, Dr. Harrison," she said quietly, her accented English careful and precise. "I can return later if you prefer." Her dignity in the face of his mockery seemed to irritate Harrison further, as if her refusal to cower or show embarrassment was somehow an act of defiance against the natural order he had constructed in his mind. Harrison's eyes gleamed with the predatory satisfaction of a cat that had cornered a mouse, and he gestured grandly toward the equation-covered whiteboard with a theatrical sweep of his manicured hand, his voice rising just enough to ensure that Dr. Peterson and Professor Williams would serve as witnesses to what he clearly intended as the morning's entertainment. "Actually, Maria, since you're here, why don't you take a crack at our little problem?" he said, his tone dripping with mock sincerity, as he stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, as if he were graciously offering her the stage at Carnegie Hall, rather than setting her up for public humiliation. "After all, we've only had some of the world's brightest minds working on this for weeks, but perhaps what we really needed was a fresh perspective from someone unburdened by all that pesky advanced education." The cruel laughter that escaped from Professor Williams sounded forced even to his own ears, while Dr. Peterson stared at his shoes as if they contained the secrets of the universe, both men uncomfortable with the spectacle, but unwilling to challenge their department head's apparent need to demonstrate his superiority over the cleaning staff. Maria stood perfectly still for a moment, her cleaning cloth forgotten in her hand, as she studied Harrison's face with an expression that was impossible to read. And when she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that everyone in the room had to lean forward to hear her words. "Which aspect of the equation would you like me to focus on, Dr. Harrison?" she asked with genuine curiosity, as if his sarcastic challenge had been a sincere request for assistance. And the innocent directness of her question sent ripples of poorly suppressed amusement through the small audience that had begun to gather as word spread through the hallways that Harrison was putting on one of his infamous shows. Graduate students began peering through the conference room's glass walls, their faces pressed against the transparent barrier like children watching a circus performance, while a few junior faculty members found excuses to linger in the hallway, drawn by the magnetic pull of academic drama and the rare opportunity to witness someone other than themselves becoming the target of Harrison's legendary wit. Harrison's smile broadened into something that resembled a shark's grin as he realized that his impromptu performance had attracted a proper audience, and he gestured toward the whiteboard with renewed theatrical flair, his voice now carrying the projected confidence of an actor who knew he had the crowd's attention. "Oh, any aspect you like, my dear," he said, savoring each word like fine wine. "Perhaps start with the quantum field operators, or maybe you'd prefer to tackle the tensor calculations. I'm sure it's all quite elementary to someone with your vast experience in theoretical physics." Maria set down her cleaning cloth with deliberate care, folding it neatly beside the stack of research papers as if she were preparing for a task that required her complete attention and then she turned toward the whiteboard with the same methodical focus she brought to every aspect of her work, her dark eyes scanning the complex mathematical landscape with a concentration that was so intense it seemed to create a bubble of silence around her, despite the growing murmur of voices in the hallway. The equation sprawled before her like a map of uncharted territory, its symbols and operators forming patterns that she absorbed with the patience of someone who understood that true comprehension could not be rushed, her gaze moving from left to right and back again as she traced the logical connections between each mathematical statement with a kind of systematic approach that comes from years of disciplined study. Behind her, the whispered commentary had begun in earnest. Graduate students exchanging knowing glances and barely suppressed giggles as they watched what they assumed was an elaborate joke unfolding before their eyes, their voices carrying just loud enough for Maria to hear fragments of their amusement. "This is unbelievable," and "Harrison's really outdone himself this time," and "I almost feel sorry for her." Dr. Peterson shifted his weight from foot to foot like a man standing on hot coals, his discomfort with the situation growing more obvious by the moment, while Professor Williams had adopted the frozen smile of someone who wasn't sure whether he should be laughing or intervening but was too paralyzed by social awkwardness to choose either option. Harrison stood with his arms crossed and his head tilted at an angle that suggested he was savoring every second of what he clearly viewed as his masterpiece of condescending theater, his pale eyes never leaving Maria's face as he waited for the inevitable moment when she would admit defeat and retreat back to her cleaning supplies, providing him with the satisfying conclusion to his morning's entertainment. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, Maria straightened her shoulders and turned away from the whiteboard, her expression calm and thoughtful as she looked directly at Harrison with those same steady dark eyes that had surprised him earlier. "Could I borrow a marker, please?" she asked in the same quiet, careful voice she had used throughout their entire exchange. And the simple request landed in the conference room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of surprise through the assembled audience who had expected her to thank him for his time and excuse herself from the room, not ask for the tools to actually engage with his impossible challenge. Maria accepted the blue dry erase marker from Harrison's manicured fingers with the same quiet courtesy she had shown throughout their entire exchange. And without a moment's hesitation, she approached the whiteboard and began writing with a steady confidence that immediately distinguished her work from the frantic scribbling that had characterized weeks of failed attempts by the Institute's most brilliant minds. Her first notation appeared in the upper right corner, an elegant transformation of the original Hamiltonian operator that utilized a mathematical technique so advanced that only 2 or 3 people in the room even recognized the theoretical framework she was employing, and her handwriting flowed across the white surface with the fluid precision of someone who had spent countless hours translating complex thoughts into mathematical language. Behind her began to falter as the graduate students noticed that Maria wasn't simply making random marks on the board, but was instead constructing a coherent mathematical argument using notation that belonged in the most sophisticated physics journals, her approach revealing an understanding of quantum field theory that far exceeded what anyone would expect from a member of the cleaning staff. Dr. Peterson found himself leaning forward despite his better judgment, his trained eye recognizing the sophisticated manipulation of tensor fields that Maria was performing with casual expertise, while Professor Williams had stopped pretending to smile and was now staring at the whiteboard with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for examining his own research. Harrison's expression had shifted from smug amusement to puzzled attention as he watched Maria complete a series of calculations that addressed one of the equation's most challenging aspects, her work demonstrating not just familiarity with advanced theoretical concepts, but an intuitive grasp of their applications that spoke to years of serious study and practice. The marker moved in her hand like an extension of her thoughts, creating mathematical poetry that seemed to dance across the white surface, each symbol placed with deliberate intention and connected to the next through logical progressions that were becoming increasingly difficult for the growing audience to follow, even though many of them held advanced degrees in theoretical physics. Graduate student conversations had dissolved into whispered questions and confused exchanges as they tried to understand exactly what they were witnessing, their earlier amusement replaced by a growing sense that something extraordinary was happening in front of them, something that challenged every assumption they had made about the quiet woman who had been cleaning their conference rooms for months. Harrison straightened his expensive tie with nervous fingers, a gesture that had become his unconscious response to situations where his complete control over events was beginning to slip away, and for the first time since issuing his sarcastic challenge, he found himself wondering whether his morning's entertainment might be taking an unexpected turn. Sarah Chen, a third-year graduate student whose dissertation focused on quantum entanglement dynamics, was the first to fully grasp the implications of what Maria was writing on the whiteboard, and her sharp intake of breath cutting through the murmured conversations like a knife, as she recognized the elegant application of renormalization group theory that Maria was using to tackle the equation's most problematic divergent integrals. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered to her fellow graduate student Marcus, her voice barely audible, but carrying enough urgency to draw immediate attention from everyone within earshot. "She's using the Wilsonian approach to effective field theory, but she's modified the cutoff parameters in a way that I've never seen before." The whispered revelation spread through the growing crowd like wildfire, each person passing along fragments of understanding to their neighbors. "She knows quantum field theory, and those calculations are graduate level, and wait, is she actually solving it?" The atmosphere in the conference room underwent a fundamental transformation as the academic audience began to realize that what they had initially dismissed as an elaborate joke was evolving into something that challenged their most basic assumptions about intelligence, education, and social hierarchy. Dr. W. Cation, end quote. Peterson abandoned all pretense of discomfort and moved closer to the whiteboard, his eyes scanning Maria's work with the intensity of a scholar encountering a rare manuscript. While Professor Williams had pulled out his phone to photograph the equations, his hands trembling slightly as he captured images of mathematical insights that might revolutionize their understanding of quantum mechanics. Harrison's carefully constructed facade of superiority began developing hairline cracks as he watched Maria continue her methodical progress across the whiteboard, her marker never pausing or hesitating as she constructed mathematical arguments that demonstrated not just competence but genuine brilliance. And for the first time in his professional career, he found himself in the unfamiliar position of watching someone work at a level that he wasn't entirely certain he could match. Maria remained completely absorbed in her calculations, her concentration so complete that she seemed oblivious to the growing audience pressing against the conference room windows, their faces reflecting a mixture of amazement, confusion, and dawning respect as they witnessed the systematic deconstruction of a problem that had defeated their collective expertise for weeks. The quiet woman who had cleaned their offices and emptied their wastebaskets was revealing herself to be a mathematician of extraordinary capability, her work flowing across the whiteboard with the kind of intuitive understanding that couldn't be faked or improvised, each step building naturally toward conclusions that were beginning to illuminate solutions that had remained hidden from some of the most accomplished physicists in the world. Maria's marker moved with increasing fluidity as she approached the equation's most challenging section, her mathematical notation becoming more dense and sophisticated with each passing minute as she constructed a solution pathway that no one in the room had even conceived of attempting, her work revealing theoretical insights that seemed to emerge from a deep well of understanding that went far beyond textbook knowledge into the realm of genuine mathematical intuition. The breakthrough moment came when she introduced a novel application of gauge theory that transformed the problematic, non-linear terms into manageable expressions, her elegant reformulation of the quantum field interactions creating a cascade of simplifications that made the previously impossible calculations suddenly tractable, and the collective intake of breath from the assembled physicists was audible as they recognized the profound implications of her approach. Dr. Peterson had abandoned all pretense of casual observation and was now frantically taking notes on his phone, his fingers flying across the screen as he tried to capture every detail of Maria's methodology, while Professor Williams had called his research partner at Stanford and was whispering urgently into his phone about witnessing what might be a genuine breakthrough in quantum field theory. The graduate students pressed closer to the glass walls, their earlier amusement completely forgotten as they struggled to follow the advanced mathematics that Maria was deploying with casual expertise, many of them realizing that they were watching techniques that wouldn't be covered in their coursework for several more years, if ever. Senior faculty members began appearing in the hallway, as word spread through the building that something extraordinary was happening in Conference Room A. Their distinguished faces reflecting the same mixture of amazement and professional curiosity that had already transformed the atmosphere from mockery to serious academic interest. Harrison stood frozen behind Maria, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like a costume that no longer fit properly, his usual confidence evaporating as he watched the cleaning lady systematically dismantle a problem that had represented the cutting edge of his department's research capabilities, her work demonstrating not just competence, but the kind of revolutionary thinking that typically emerged from the most elite institutions in the world. The equation was beginning to yield its secrets under Maria's patient assault, her calculations revealing hidden symmetries and unexpected connections that opened new avenues for understanding quantum mechanics in ways that could potentially reshape entire fields of research, and Harrison found himself confronting the uncomfortable realization that his morning's entertainment had transformed into a professional humiliation of proportions he had never imagined possible. Maria paused for a moment to study her work, her dark eyes scanning the whiteboard with the same methodical attention she had brought to every aspect of the problem, and then she reached for a different colored marker to begin the final phase of her solution, completely unaware that she had already shattered every assumption about intelligence and education that had governed the academic hierarchy of one of the world's most prestigious research institutions. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the Institute's most distinguished theorist and a recipient of the prestigious Dirac Medal for her contributions to quantum mechanics, pushed through the crowd that had gathered outside Conference Room A. With the determined stride of someone accustomed to getting answers to questions that puzzled her, and when she finally reached the whiteboard and began studying Maria's calculations, her expression shifted from polite curiosity to profound astonishment as she recognized mathematical techniques that represented a fundamental leap forward in theoretical understanding. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Hartwell announced to the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose opinions had shaped physics textbooks for 3 decades. "She's not just solving the equation. She's revealing connections between quantum field theory and topological mathematics that could revolutionize how we approach computational quantum mechanics." The words hung in the air like a pronouncement from oracle, transforming the atmosphere in the conference room from academic curiosity to something approaching religious reverence as physicists from across the building continued to stream into the hallway, their faces pressed against the glass walls as they tried to catch glimpses of the mathematical revelation unfolding on the whiteboard. Maria had entered the final phase of her solution, her red marker tracing elegant curves and complex integrals that seemed to dance across the white surface, each calculation building toward conclusions that opened entirely new theoretical frameworks for understanding the quantum world. Her work demonstrating the kind of intuitive brilliance that emerged perhaps once in a generation and changed the fundamental direction of scientific research. Professors who had spent decades studying quantum mechanics found themselves scrambling to understand techniques that Maria was employing with casual expertise, their notebooks filling with frantic sketches and partial equations as they tried to follow her reasoning through mathematical territories that most of them had never explored, and several senior faculty members had already begun making phone calls to colleagues at other institutions, their voices urgent with the excitement of scholars who had witnessed something that would be discussed in physics departments around the world. Harrison's face had drained of all color, his pale complexion taking on the gray pallor of someone who had just realized that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him, his hands trembling slightly as he watched the cleaning lady he had mocked and humiliated demonstrate intellectual capabilities that far exceeded his own considerable expertise, her work revealing depths of understanding that made his own published research seem elementary by comparison. The magnitude of his mistake was becoming clear to everyone in the room, his morning's entertainment having transformed into a catastrophic miscalculation that would haunt his professional reputation for years to come. And as Maria continued her methodical progress toward the solution's completion, Harrison found himself confronting the terrifying possibility that he had just publicly humiliated himself in front of the most accomplished physicists in the academic world. Dr. Hartwell was the first to voice the question that had been forming in everyone's mind. As they watched Maria complete mathematical operations that belonged in the most advanced physics journals, her distinguished voice cutting through the amazed murmur of conversations, with the directness of someone who had spent her career asking difficult questions and demanding honest answers. "Excuse me, Dr. WWWW," Hartwell said, stepping closer to Maria with the respectful tone she typically reserved for conversations with Nobel laureates. "But I think we all need to know exactly who you are, because what you're doing here represents work at the absolute frontier of theoretical physics." The conference room fell into complete silence as every eye turned toward Maria, who continued working with the same methodical concentration she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, her marker moving steadily across the whiteboard as if the growing crowd of distinguished academics were merely invisible observers rather than some of the most accomplished scientists in the world. Her calm demeanor created a stark contrast to the electric tension that filled the room, where professors and graduate students stood frozen in various states of shock, their faces reflecting the cognitive dissonance of witnessing someone they had dismissed as intellectually inferior demonstrate capabilities that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about intelligence and social hierarchy. Harrison's voice cracked slightly when he finally found the courage to speak, his usual commanding presence reduced to something that sounded more like desperation than authority as he stepped forward with the jerky movements of a man whose world had just shifted beneath his feet. "Yes, I demand to know your credentials immediately," Harrison said, his words carrying the hollow ring of someone trying to reassert control over a situation that had already spiraled completely beyond his influence. No one without advanced training could possibly understand these concepts, let alone apply them with this level of sophistication. Maria paused in her calculations just long enough to glance over her shoulder at Harrison, her dark eyes meeting his pale blue ones with the same steady composure that had characterized her behavior throughout their entire interaction. And when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove and no need to justify her existence to anyone. "I appreciate your concern, Dr. Harrison," she said with the same careful politeness she had maintained even during his most condescending attacks. "But I would prefer to finish this solution before we discuss anything else, if that's acceptable to everyone." The simple statement had the effect of highlighting just how completely the power dynamic in the room had shifted, for her ability to remain focused on the mathematical problem, while everyone else struggled to process the implications of what they were witnessing, demonstrating a level of intellectual discipline that commanded respect from even the most skeptical observers. And she turned back to the whiteboard to continue her work, as if the question of her identity was far less important than completing the elegant proof that was taking shape beneath her steady hand. Maria stepped back from the whiteboard with the quiet satisfaction of an artist who had just completed a masterpiece, her final calculations forming an elegant mathematical symphony that transformed the previously impossible equation into a series of solvable expressions that opened entirely new pathways for understanding quantum mechanics at the deep, fundamental level. The solution sprawled across the entire whiteboard in 3 distinct colors of ink, each section building logically toward the next in a progression that demonstrated not just technical mastery but genuine mathematical beauty, her work revealing hidden symmetries in the quantum field equations that suggested revolutionary applications for quantum computing architectures that could potentially solve problems beyond current technological imagination. The moment Maria set down her marker and turned to face the assembled crowd, the conference room erupted into a cacophony of amazed voices as physicists who had dedicated their lives to understanding the fundamental forces of nature struggled to process the implications of what they had just witnessed, their excited conversations overlapping and interweaving as they pointed at different sections of the solution and tried to explain to their colleagues the profound insights that Maria had revealed through her methodical deconstruction of the problem. Dr. Hartwell was photographing every section of the whiteboard with the urgency of an archaeologist documenting a major discovery, while Professor Williams had his phone pressed to his ear, speaking rapidly to someone about the need for an emergency consultation with the Quantum Computing Consortium, and graduate students were frantically copying equations into their notebooks as if they were transcribing sacred texts that might hold the keys to their future research careers. The mathematical revelation on the whiteboard represented more than just a solution to a difficult problem. It was a roadmap toward quantum technologies that could revolutionize everything from cryptography to drug discovery, and the assembled physicists recognized that they were witnessing the birth of theoretical frameworks that would influence scientific research for decades to come. Harrison stood frozen in the center of the chaos, his expensive suit and perfectly groomed appearance suddenly making him look like an actor who had forgotten his lines in the middle of a performance, his face reflecting the dawning horror of someone who had just realized that his morning's entertainment had transformed into the most catastrophic professional mistake of his entire career. The cleaning lady he had mocked and humiliated had not only solved the equation that had defeated his entire department, but had done so with a level of brilliance that made his own considerable accomplishments seem pedestrian by comparison. And as the excited conversation swirled around him, Harrison found himself confronting the terrifying reality that his reputation as a distinguished physicist had just been shattered by someone he had assumed was beneath his notice, let alone his respect. Maria turned away from the whiteboard with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, her dark eyes scanning the faces of the assembled physicists, who were still struggling to process the mathematical revelation they had just witnessed. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the calm authority of someone who was about to provide answers to questions that were already transforming the academic world around them. "My name is Dr. Maria Santos," she said, her careful pronunciation giving each word the weight of a formal introduction. "And I hold the Nobel Prize in Theoretical Physics for my work on quantum field unification, which I received in 2018 for research that was conducted at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton." The silence that followed her words was so complete that the only sound in the conference room was the gentle hum of the air conditioning system, as if the entire building had suddenly held its breath while the assembled academics processed information that challenged every assumption they had made about the quiet woman who had been cleaning their offices and emptying their wastebaskets for the past 6 months. Dr. Flashed ADRN Splakesits. Hartwell's distinguished face went through a series of expressions that ranged from shock to embarrassment to something approaching awe as she recognized the name that belonged in the same conversations as Einstein, Feynman, and Hawking, her hands trembling slightly as she realized she had been witnessing one of the world's most accomplished physicists working at the peak of her intellectual powers. "I have been working undercover at this institute for 6 months," Maria continued with the same measured cadence, "conducting research into the culture of academic institutions and the ways in which unconscious bias affects the treatment of individuals based on their appearance, their accent, their perceived social status, and their job title rather than their actual capabilities or contributions to human knowledge." The room erupted into chaos as the full implications of her revelations sank in, voices rising in amazement, embarrassment, and recognition as faculty members suddenly remembered every interaction they had ever had with the woman they now realized was one of the most celebrated scientists of their generation, and several professors began frantically searching their phones for photographs and biographical information about Dr. Planet Maria Santos, their faces reflecting the horror of people who were discovering exactly how badly they had misjudged someone whose work they had studied and cited in their own research. Graduate students were whispering urgently to each other as they recalled moments when they had ignored or dismissed Maria, their conversations filled with the kind of self-recrimination that comes from realizing you have been blind to greatness that was hiding in plain sight. And Harrison stood at the center of the storm with the expression of a man who had just watched his entire professional world collapse around him. Harrison's carefully constructed professional persona shattered like fine crystal hitting concrete as the full weight of his catastrophic mistake became clear to everyone in the room, his pale face cycling through expressions of shock, denial, and desperate panic as he realized that he had just publicly humiliated a Nobel Prize winner in front of witnesses whose respect had taken him decades to earn and mere minutes to destroy completely. "Santos? I had no idea," Harrison stammered, his usual commanding voice reduced to the trembling whisper of someone whose world had just imploded. "If I had known who you were, I would never have. I mean, I was simply trying to." His attempts at explanation trailed off into incoherent fragments as he struggled to find words that could somehow undo the damage he had inflicted on his own reputation, his manicured hands gesturing helplessly in the air, as if he could physically grasp the apology that refused to form coherently in his mouth. The other faculty members in the room began an almost unconscious process of distancing themselves from Harrison's behavior, their body language shifting as they stepped away from him and toward Maria, their expressions reflecting the kind of professional embarrassment that comes from being associated with someone who had just committed academic suicide in front of an audience of distinguished colleagues. Dr. Peterson shook his head in disgust as he remembered his own uncomfortable silence during Harrison's performance, while Professor Williams looked as if he wanted to disappear through the floor rather than acknowledge his participation in what had now been revealed as the public humiliation of one of the world's most respected physicists. "Please understand," Harrison continued, his voice cracking with desperation. "I treat all our staff with respect. This was just a moment of poor judgment, and I deeply regret any offense I may have caused." Maria listened to his pathetic attempts at damage control with the same patient attention she had given to the quantum mechanics equation, her expression remaining calm and dignified, even as she watched a man who had built his career on intellectual arrogance discover the consequences of his own cruelty and prejudice. "Dr. Harrison," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had no need to raise her tone to command attention, "the purpose of my research was not to entrap anyone or to create embarrassing situations, but rather to document the ways in which unconscious bias operates in academic environments and to understand how institutional cultures can either support or undermine the principles of intellectual merit and human dignity that should guide all scholarly endeavors." Her words carried the weight of someone who had transformed personal humiliation into scientific data, her ability to maintain professional composure in the face of such treatment, demonstrating the kind of character that true academic excellence required, but rarely received the recognition it deserved. Maria reached into the pocket of her simple gray uniform and withdrew a small digital recording device, its presence transforming her cleaning supplies and humble appearance into the sophisticated tools of a social scientist who had been conducting rigorous fieldwork in an environment where she was treated as invisible, and her calm revelation that she had been systematically documenting discriminatory behavior sent a ripple of concern through the assembled faculty members, who were beginning to realize that Harrison's public humiliation was merely the tip of an iceberg that threatened the reputation of their entire institution. Over the past 6 months, Maria explained with the methodical precision of a researcher presenting findings to an academic conference, "I have recorded over 200 instances of discriminatory behavior, ranging from casual dismissal of support staff to explicit bias against individuals based on their ethnicity, their accent, their gender, and their perceived social class, and I have documented patterns of institutional culture that systematically undervalue human dignity in favor of maintaining hierarchical structures that serve the comfort of those in positions of power." The recording device seemed to pulse with dangerous potential as faculty members throughout the room began conducting rapid mental inventories of their own behavior over the past 6 months, their faces reflecting the growing horror of people who were discovering that their casual cruelties and unconscious prejudices had been carefully catalogued by someone whose scientific credentials gave her observations the weight of legitimate academic research. Dr. Hartwell's distinguished face had taken on the gray pallor of someone contemplating professional disaster as she realized that Maria's research could potentially expose the Einstein Institute to the kind of scrutiny that had destroyed the reputations of other prestigious academic institutions, and several junior faculty members were already calculating the potential impact on their own careers if the institute's culture of elitism and discrimination became the subject of public investigation. "The data I have collected reveals systemic problems that extend far beyond individual incidents of poor behavior," Maria continued, her voice maintaining the same calm authority that had characterized her mathematical presentation. "And my research suggests that these patterns of discrimination are not aberrations but rather integral features of an institutional culture that prioritizes status and appearance over competence and character." The implications of her words hung in the air like a sword over the heads of everyone present, as they began to understand that their institution's reputation for academic excellence was about to be weighed against its record of human decency, and the assembled physicists who had spent their careers building distinguished reputations suddenly found themselves confronting the possibility that their association with the Einstein Institute might become a liability rather than an asset if Maria's research findings became public knowledge through academic journals or media investigations that could transform their prestigious workplace into a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked academic arrogance. Dr. Margaret Whitfield, the Einstein Institute's director, and a physicist whose own groundbreaking work on dark matter had earned her international recognition, swept into conference room A. With the purposeful stride of someone who had built her career on transforming crisis into opportunity, and her silver hair and commanding presence immediately shifting the room's dynamic as faculty members instinctively stepped aside to allow her access to the situation that had already begun generating urgent phone calls from concerned board members and worried donors. "I've been informed that we have a serious situation developing here," Dr. Whitfield announced, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had spent decades managing academic institutions through various scandals and controversies. "And I want to understand exactly what has transpired and what steps we need to take to address any problems that have been brought to our attention." Her eyes moved systematically around the room, taking in the evidence on the whiteboard, the assembled crowd of faculty and students, and the unmistakable tension that filled the air like electrical charge before a thunderstorm. And when her gaze finally settled on Maria, there was a flicker of recognition that suggested she was already beginning to piece together the implications of what had occurred. Harrison attempted to step forward and control the narrative, his desperation making him even more reckless than usual as he tried to minimize the severity of his behavior. But Dr. Whitfield silenced him with a single raised hand and the kind of withering look that had intimidated university presidents and Nobel laureates alike throughout her distinguished administrative career. "Dr. Santos," Dr. Whitfield said, addressing Maria with the respect that her credentials demanded, "I believe you have information that our institution needs to hear, and I want you to know that we are prepared to listen with complete attention and to take whatever actions are necessary to address any problems you have identified." Maria nodded with quiet appreciation for the director's direct approach, and from her uniform pocket, she produced not just the recording device, but a tablet computer containing 6 months of carefully organized data, photographs, audio recordings, and detailed analytical reports that documented patterns of discrimination with the same rigorous methodology she had applied to her Nobel Prize-winning research in theoretical physics. "I have prepared a comprehensive report," Maria explained, her voice maintaining its characteristic calm, even as she presented evidence that could potentially destroy careers and reputations, that documents systematic bias throughout this institution, affecting not only cleaning staff but also graduate students, junior faculty, visiting scholars, and anyone else who fails to meet certain unspoken criteria related to appearance, accent, social background, and perceived status within the academic hierarchy. The room fell into stunned silence as the full scope of Maria's investigation became clear, and Dr. Whitfield's expression shifted from concern to grim determination as she realized that her institution was facing a reckoning that would require immediate and decisive action to prevent a scandal that could undermine decades of carefully built academic reputation. Dr. Whitfield's response to Maria's revelations was swift and comprehensive, demonstrating the kind of decisive leadership that had made her one of the most respected administrators in academic science. And within 72 hours of the conference room confrontation, she had convened an emergency session of the Institute's board of directors, implemented immediate policy changes, and begun the process of transforming the Einstein Institute's culture from one that tolerated discrimination to one that actively promoted inclusion and respect for all members of the academic community. The new policies were extensive and enforceable, including mandatory sensitivity training for every faculty member, staff person, and graduate student, regular anonymous surveys to monitor workplace climate, clear reporting mechanisms for discriminatory behavior, and strict consequences for violations that ranged from formal reprimands to termination depending on the severity of the offense. Harrison's immediate demotion from department head to associate professor without administrative responsibilities sent shockwaves through the academic hierarchy, his loss of prestige and influence serving as a clear signal that the Institute's tolerance for discriminatory behavior had ended permanently, and his mandatory enrollment in an intensive 6-month program on inclusive leadership and unconscious bias training became a visible reminder that even distinguished faculty members were not immune to consequences when their actions harmed the institutional community. The transformation extended beyond policy changes to include structural reforms that addressed the underlying power dynamics that had allowed discrimination to flourish unchecked, with new oversight committees that included representatives from all levels of the institutional hierarchy, regular review processes for evaluating faculty behavior toward colleagues and staff, and transparent promotion criteria that explicitly included demonstrated commitment to creating an inclusive academic environment. Maria's research findings were incorporated into a comprehensive audit of institutional practices conducted by external consultants who specialized in academic organizational culture, their recommendations forming the foundation for a multi-year initiative designed to make the Einstein Institute a model for inclusive excellence in scientific research and education. The Institute's board of directors publicly acknowledged the problems that Maria's investigation had revealed, issuing a formal apology to all members of the community who had experienced discrimination and committing substantial financial resources to ensure that the cultural transformation would be thorough, sustainable, and measurable through regular assessment and accountability mechanisms. Faculty members who had initially worried about the impact on their careers began to recognize that the changes were actually strengthening the Institute's reputation by demonstrating institutional integrity and commitment to the values that should guide all academic endeavors, and the story of Maria's investigation became a powerful reminder that true academic excellence required not just intellectual brilliance, but also moral courage and respect for human dignity in all its forms. The story of Maria's undercover investigation and Harrison's public humiliation spread through the global scientific community with the velocity of a breakthrough discovery, carried by social media, academic conferences, and the informal networks that connected researchers across continents, transforming what had begun as a single incident of workplace discrimination into a catalyst for institutional self-examination at universities and research facilities, from MIT to Oxford to Tokyo. Within weeks, science journals were publishing editorials about the hidden biases that pervaded academic culture, and institutional leaders found themselves fielding questions from faculty, students, and donors about their own policies regarding discrimination and inclusive practices, with many organizations launching internal reviews to identify and address problems before they became public scandals that could damage carefully cultivated reputations. The quantum mechanics equation that Maria had solved with such elegant precision became the foundation for revolutionary advances in quantum computing research, her mathematical insights opening pathways toward computational architectures that could potentially solve climate modeling problems, drug discovery challenges, and cryptographic puzzles that had previously been considered intractable, and technology companies began competing to recruit the graduate students and faculty members who were working to understand and apply her theoretical breakthroughs. Harrison's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire saga, his initial shock and humiliation gradually evolving into genuine self-reflection as he began to recognize the patterns of prejudice and arrogance that had shaped his interactions with colleagues, students, and staff throughout his career, and his mandatory training sessions became opportunities for authentic learning rather than merely punishment to be endured. The man who had once used his intelligence as a weapon against those he deemed inferior began speaking publicly about the dangers of academic elitism, in his presentations at conferences and workshops, carrying the credibility of someone who had experienced firsthand the consequences of allowing intellectual achievement to justify moral failure, and his journey from arrogant antagonist to advocate for inclusive excellence became a powerful example of how personal growth could emerge from professional humiliation. Maria's research methodology was adopted by sociologists and organizational psychologists studying workplace discrimination in other high-status professions, her approach demonstrating how ethnographic techniques could be applied to environments where traditional survey methods might be compromised by power dynamics and social desirability bias, and her work became required reading in graduate programs that trained future leaders for academic and corporate institutions. The Einstein Institute itself became a destination for scholars studying organizational change and inclusive leadership. Its transformation from a culture of discrimination to a model of respectful excellence attracting visitors who wanted to understand how institutions could evolve beyond their problematic histories while maintaining their commitment to intellectual rigor and scientific achievement. 6 months after the conference room confrontation that had shattered his world, Harrison stood before an audience of 200 distinguished academics at the International Conference on Scientific Ethics, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by the humble authenticity of someone who had undergone genuine transformation through confronting the worst aspects of his own character and choosing to rebuild himself from the foundation upward. "I am here today not as an expert on inclusive leadership," Harrison began, his voice carrying none of the condescending authority that had once characterized his public speaking, "but as someone who learned the hard way that intellectual achievement means nothing if it is not accompanied by moral integrity and respect for the dignity of every human being we encounter in our professional lives." His presentation detailed the systematic process of self-examination he had undergone, working with counselors, diversity trainers, and former colleagues to understand how his privileged background and academic success had blinded him to the ways his behavior had harmed others, and his willingness to expose his own failures became a powerful tool for encouraging other academics to examine their own unconscious biases before they caused similar damage to their institutions and communities. The transformation was so complete that former colleagues who had once feared his cutting remarks now sought his advice on creating more inclusive research environments, and his genuine commitment to change had earned him a new kind of respect that was based not on intimidation but on the moral courage required to acknowledge wrongdoing and work tirelessly to make amends. Maria's research had indeed become a catalyst for industry-wide transformation, with over 50 major research institutions implementing policies based on her findings, and her methodology for studying workplace discrimination had been refined and applied in contexts ranging from medical schools to technology companies, creating a growing body of evidence about the ways unconscious bias operated in high-status professional environments. The Einstein Institute had become an unexpected leader in inclusive excellence, its reputation enhanced rather than damaged by its willingness to confront and address its cultural problems, and delegations of administrators and faculty members from other institutions regularly visited to study the comprehensive reforms that had transformed the workplace culture while maintaining the highest standards of scientific achievement. Harrison's redemption arc had become almost as famous as Maria's original investigation, his journey from academic bully to advocate for inclusion serving as proof that even the most entrenched patterns of discrimination could be changed through sustained effort and genuine commitment to personal growth, and his collaboration with Maria on research projects exploring the intersection of cognitive bias and scientific methodology had produced work that was reshaping how academics thought about objectivity, fairness, and the social responsibilities that came with intellectual privilege and institutional power. 2 years after the morning that had changed everything, Maria stood once again in Conference Room A, but this time she wore the formal robes of her position as the Einstein Institute's newly appointed Director of Inclusive Excellence, her Nobel Prize medallion catching the light as she addressed a diverse group of faculty, staff, and students who had gathered to celebrate the completion of the most comprehensive study of workplace transformation ever conducted in academic science. The whiteboard behind her displayed not equations but photographs and testimonials from hundreds of individuals whose lives had been touched by the cultural revolution that had begun with a simple challenge to solve an impossible problem, and her quiet voice carried the same dignity that had sustained her through months of invisible labor and public humiliation as she reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment of genuine celebration. "The power to change the world does not reside in our credentials or our titles," Maria said, her words reaching every corner of the room where Harrison sat in the front row. His transformation from antagonist to ally complete and irreversible, but in our willingness to treat every human being we encounter with the respect and dignity that reflects our shared humanity, rather than our differences in education, background, or social status. The Einstein Institute had indeed become a beacon of inclusive excellence, its research productivity reaching new heights as talented individuals from diverse backgrounds found themselves welcomed and valued for their contributions, rather than judged by superficial characteristics. And the quantum computing breakthroughs that had emerged from Maria's original equation were now being developed by international teams that reflected the full spectrum of human talent and perspective. Harrison raised his hand to speak, his voice steady with the conviction of someone who had learned to value truth over comfort. And he addressed the audience with the same honesty that had characterized his transformation over the past 2 years. I want every person in this room to understand that the greatest discovery of my career was not any scientific breakthrough, but learning that true intelligence includes the wisdom to recognize intelligence in others, regardless of how they dress, how they speak, or what job they perform, he said, his words carrying the weight of hard-won insight. And that the measure of our character is not found in our ability to demonstrate our superiority over others, but in our capacity to lift others up and create environments where everyone can contribute their unique gifts to our collective understanding of the universe. The story that had begun with mockery and prejudice had evolved into something far more powerful. A reminder that beneath every uniform, behind every accent, and beyond every assumption about social status, there existed the possibility of extraordinary talent, profound wisdom, and boundless potential, waiting to be recognized by those with the courage to see beyond the surface to the character that truly defined human worth.